Hi everyone, welcome to Talk Easy. Today, Catherine and Mike will simplify the passive voice like the book was read by me. Learn when and how to use it for formal writing and reports. Let's get started.
All right, so today we're diving into something that might seem kind of basic at first.
Yeah.
But trust me,
Yeah.
way more interesting than it sounds. We're talking about the passive voice.
Mm-hmm.
I know grammar can be a bit dry,
Right.
but the passive voice is like this secret weapon in writing that we use all the time
It really is.
without even realizing it.
Exactly.
So to help us unpack all this, we've got two sources lined up, and get this.
Okay.
They're both podcasts called The Passive Voice Made Easy.
Interesting.
Isn't that kind of funny?
Yeah, that's a pretty common title, I guess.
Yeah, you'd think they'd come up with something a little more creative.
Right.
But hey, maybe it's a sign that they both have some seriously good insights to share.
I'm intrigued.
Me too.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to go beyond the basic definition of the passive voice.
Okay.
You know, like subject, verb, object, all that jazz.
Right.
And really dig into why it matters. Why should we even care about this thing?
Well, I think one of the biggest reasons is that the passive voice gets a bad rap.
It does.
People say it's weak or clunky, but used strategically, it can be incredibly effective.
Okay, so we're going to bust some myths today.
Absolutely.
Like it. So how about we start with the basics?
Sure.
What exactly is the passive voice? Can you give us like a simple definition?
Well, the easiest way to think about it is to contrast it with the active voice.
Okay.
In the active voice, the subject is doing the action like the chef cooked the meal.
Right, straightforward.
But in the passive voice, the action is happening to the subject, so it becomes the meal was cooked by the chef.
Ah, so the focus kind of shifts. Right.
Exactly. It goes from who did it to what was done.
I see. That's actually pretty cool when you think about it.
It is.
It's like turning the spotlight around.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this shift in focus.
Yeah.
But why would someone want to use the passive voice?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
Sometimes you want to emphasize the action itself or the object that's being acted upon.
Okay, I'm listening.
For example, imagine you're reading a news headline that says, bank robbed.
Oh yeah, that grabs your attention.
Right. It creates the sense of urgency and drama.
Definitely.
And you're immediately drawn to the event itself, not to who did the robbing.
So the passive voice gets straight to the point.
Exactly. No distractions.
I like that. So are there any other times when it's particularly useful?
Absolutely. Think about scientific writing.
Okay.
You might see a sentence like, the experiment was conducted under controlled conditions.
Right. I've definitely read that before.
Using the passive voice there keeps the focus on the methodology and the results.
Gotcha. Not on the scientists themselves.
Exactly. It adds this layer of objectivity.
Like it's all about the science, not about personal bias.
Precisely.
That makes a lot of sense. And, you know, our sources also talk about how the passive voice can be really handy when you don't actually know who performed the action.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
Like mistakes were made.
Exactly. You're acknowledging the action without pointing fingers.
Or getting into a whole blame game.
Right. You're just stating the facts.
Okay, so we've got emphasizing the action, creating a sense of objectivity,
Mm.
and navigating those situations where the actor is unknown. What other reasons would someone choose the passive voice?
Well, it can also create a more formal tone,
Oh, okay.
which is why you often see it in legal documents, academic writing, or official reports.
So it's like dressing up your writing,
Exactly. It adds a level of authority and detachment to the information.
making it sound more official and important.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that while the passive voice has its advantages,
Yep.
there are times when you definitely want to avoid it.
Like when?
Well, one of the biggest pitfalls is overuse.
Too much of a good thing.
Right. It can make your writing sound really convoluted and distant if you rely on it too heavily.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
One of our sources gives this hilarious example.
Okay, let's hear it.
The ball was thrown by the boy, and the window was broken by the ball.
Oh my gosh, that's painful.
Right. It's like a robot trying to describe a playground scene.
How would you rewrite that to make it sound more natural?
Easy. The boy threw the ball, and it broke the window.
Much better. Direct and to the point.
Exactly. So it's all about balance. Using the passive voice strategically, but not letting it take over your entire writing style.
Okay, I'm starting to see the nuances here.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to admit, actually constructing a passive voice sentence still feels a bit like a puzzle to me.
I can see that, but it's really just a matter of rearranging the pieces.
Okay, walk me through it.
The basic formula is subject plus the verb to be plus the past participle of the main verb and then optionally by plus the agent.
Okay, hold on, let's break that down. The agent being the person or thing performing the action, right?
Exactly. And here's the interesting part. The agent is optional.
Oh, really?
Sometimes you need it for clarity, but often you can leave it out entirely. Like in our earlier example, the meal was cooked by the chef. You could just as easily say the meal was cooked.
And it still makes sense, especially if we're just focusing on the meal itself.
Exactly. Context is key.
Our sources also mention that you can use the passive voice in different tenses,
Yes, indeed.
which seems kind of mind-boggling at first.
It can be, but it's actually quite logical. For instance, take the present simple passive. The cake is baked every day. We use the present tense of to be is plus the past participle of bake.
Okay, I think I'm following. So if we wanted to talk about yesterday's cake, we'd use the past simple passive, right?
You got it. The cake was baked yesterday. Same structure, just a different tense.
And we could do the same for future actions.
Absolutely. The cake will be baked tomorrow.
Wow, so the passive voice is surprisingly versatile.
Very much so.
But before we get too carried away, our sources also caution against some common mistakes that people make.
Oh yeah, there are a few.
What's the biggest one we should watch out for?
Definitely misusing the verb to be.
Okay.
It needs to match the tense of your sentence. You wouldn't say the letter is sent yesterday.
Right, that sounds off.
The correct form would be the letter was sent yesterday.
I see.
Another common mistake is forgetting to include the agent when it's actually crucial for understanding. Like if you just say, the project was completed.
By whom? Exactly. We need more information.
We need that extra bit of info. The project was completed by the entire team
Now it's clear who deserves the credit.
or the blame.
Right, depending on how the project went.
Exactly. But honestly, the biggest mistake is simply not being aware of how we're using the passive voice.
You mean like not thinking about it consciously?
Exactly. And whether it's the best choice for the situation.
So it's about making intentional choices as writers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Using the passive voice with purpose.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm feeling pretty good about the mechanics of the passive voice now.
Great.
But what about the real-world implications? How does all of this actually play out in different fields?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next.
Awesome, I'm ready.
Me too. It
Okay.
really is all about being intentional with your language, right? Making those conscious choices.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, so you were about to tell us how this whole passive voice thing actually plays out in different fields.
Oh, right. Well, think about how often we encounter the passive voice without even realizing it. Like, take news reports, for example. Instead of saying, the president announced a new policy, you might hear, a new policy was announced.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I never really stopped to think about why news reports use that kind of phrasing.
It's all about creating a sense of objectivity and neutrality.
Oh, I see. Like taking the focus off the individual and putting it on the event itself.
Exactly. And this isn't just limited to news. Think about scientific writing.
Okay.
You know those research papers and articles?
Yeah.
You might read something like, the data was analyzed using a statistical software program.
Right.
Again, the focus is on the methods and the findings, not on the specific scientists who did the analysis.
So it's like presenting the science as this universal process.
Exactly. Anyone could have followed these steps and arrived at the same results.
Which is kind of powerful when you think about it.
It is. And the same principle applies to historical writing.
Oh, okay. How so?
Imagine reading a sentence like, the pyramids were built over thousands of years. The focus is on this monumental achievement, not on the countless individuals who labored to make it happen.
Yeah, that's a good example. The passive voice really gives a sense of scope and grandeur to historical events.
It does. It's a way of highlighting the impact and significance of an event without getting bogged down in the specifics of who did what.
But I'm also thinking about how the passive voice can be misused, right? Like to avoid taking responsibility for something.
Absolutely. That's the flip side of the coin.
It's like that classic mistakes were made scenario.
Exactly. It's a way of deflecting blame or avoiding ownership.
So how can we as listeners and readers become more aware of when this is happening? Like when the passive voice is being used to kind of hide something?
That's a great question. I think the key is to start paying attention to the absence of information.
Okay, I'm listening.
When you hear a sentence like, the decision was made to cut funding, ask yourself, who made that decision? Why might they be avoiding naming names?
That's such a good point. It's like the passive voice can create these little gaps in the
Right.
narrative. And sometimes those gaps are deliberate.
Precisely. And once you start noticing those gaps, you can start asking those critical questions and filling in the missing pieces for yourself.
So it's not just about recognizing the passive voice itself.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to become more discerning and informed consumers of information.
Exactly. It's about developing that critical thinking muscle and not just accepting everything you hear or read at face value.
I love that analogy, developing that critical thinking muscle.
It's so important in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
So true. Okay, we've talked about news reports, scientific writing, historical writing, but our sources also mentioned that the passive voice is pretty much a staple in formal writing, like legal documents and academic papers.
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere in those contexts.
Why is that? What's the reasoning behind it?
Well, as we talked about earlier, it adds a level of formality and authority to the writing.
Right, like putting on a suit and tie for your words.
Exactly. And it also helps create a sense of distance and objectivity, which is often desirable in those fields.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about a legal statement like, the defendant was found guilty. It sounds more impartial than saying, the jury found the defendant guilty.
Yeah, it does, even though they technically mean the same thing.
Right. The passive voice creates this subtle shift in emphasis, making the statement sound more objective and less personal.
You know, I'm starting to realize that the passive voice isn't just about grammar.
Hmm.
It's about understanding how language can be used to shape our perceptions and interpretations of the world around us.
That's a brilliant insight. You've hit the nail on the head.
And it makes me think that understanding this seemingly simple grammatical concept is actually really important
It is.
because it gives us a deeper understanding of how information is presented and how language can be used to persuade, inform, or even mislead.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Okay, so my mind is officially blown. I feel like I've been sleepwalking through the world of language, and now I'm suddenly wide awake.
I love that. That's a great way to put it.
But before we get too carried away with the philosophical implications of all this,
Okay.
our sources did mention that the passive voice can be a bit tricky to use correctly.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some pitfalls to avoid.
Besides misusing the verb to be and forgetting to include the agent when it's necessary, what are some other common mistakes people should watch out for?
Well, one of the most common ones is simply using the passive voice when the active voice would be clearer and more direct.
Oh, I can see that happening.
For example, the ball was hit by the batter is grammatically correct,
Right.
but the batter hit the ball is just more straightforward and engaging.
Yeah, it's like sometimes the passive voice adds this unnecessary layer of complexity,
Exactly.
especially in casual conversation.
It would sound pretty weird to say, the groceries were bought by me, instead of just, I bought the grocery.
So true. So it's not about using the passive voice whenever possible.
No, not at all.
It's about understanding when it's the most effective tool for the job and when it's better to just stick with the active voice.
It's all about making conscious choices as writers and speakers.
Understanding the impact of our words and choosing the best way to convey our message.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, so we spent all this time talking about the passive voice and how it's not just about, dry grammar rules.
Right. It's so much more than that.
It's really about how language can be used to shape our perceptions, sometimes even manipulate them.
Exactly. Like we were saying before about how it can be used to obscure responsibility.
Right, like that whole mistakes were made thing.
It happens all the time, especially in politics and business.
So how can we as listeners and readers become more savvy about recognizing when this is happening? When someone's using the passive voice to kind of dodge the blame?
Well, I think one of the biggest clues is the absence of information.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
When you hear a sentence like, the decision was made to cut funding, stop and ask yourself who made that decision.
Right, they're not telling us.
Exactly. And there's probably a reason for that. They might be trying to avoid taking ownership or deflecting blame.
So it's like the passive voice creates these little gaps in the story.
Exactly.
Recognizing the passive voice itself.
Right.
It's about using that knowledge to dig deeper and get the full picture.
It's about thinking critically and not taking everything at face value.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thinking critically, that's what it's all about.
Exactly. And that's one of the most important skills we can develop in today's world.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on language now.
Me too. It's amazing how much we take for granted.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, I think it's safe to say we've successfully demystified the passive voice today.
I think so.
And hopefully we've inspired our listeners to embrace its power and versatility.
I hope so too.
Any final words of wisdom before we sign off?
Just keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep paying attention to the fascinating ways language shapes our world.
Couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Right.
A huge thank you to our expert for joining us and sharing all these insights.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here with us today. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of the passive voice, and that you'll join us again for our next deep dive into the fascinating world of language. Until then, stay curious and keep those brains buzzing.